All right, so I guess we should start with an introduction. My name is Coriell. I'm the Information Literacy Librarian over at the Warner Library.
I'm Ruth Baker, I'm the Writing Center Coordinator, and I'm Chelsea Post, I'm the Systems Librarian.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about how to read an academic article. All right, I'm sure you all have your reasons to be here and you know why this is important already, so I'm going to get right into it. What makes a source scholarly? You're going to hear that term a lot. And that's something your professors are probably harping on. You can't just use anything you find online. It's got to come from a scholarly source. But what makes something scholarly? So that relates to the author first. The author typically works in the field or they have some sort of experience that would explain why they're doing studies, research, so on and so forth. This article should also be verified by others in their field. That's called peer reviewed. Peer review is an important part of making sure that what someone says is credible. If there's a study, someone might replicate it in some meaningful way. So a scholarly source is often published in an accredited journal. And when you go through all the way at the end, they're going to have a works cited or a reference page. So you can find out where they got their information if they are referencing something in their literature review or rebutting someone else's article. So what else do you need to consider? That's not the end all be all. It's also important to consider when was it published rather, and does it pass the CRAP test? If you were in INST 150 over the last 2 weeks, you probably heard a lot about this. And you remember that the first C in CRAP stands for currency. Typically, we like to keep it within the last 5 years. If you're in a field like technology or nursing, you know that things update a lot really quickly. So something from 1991, that's long past. Unless we're talking about a historical precedent for something, that's no good to you. There are other parts of the CRAP test like relevancy, authority, accuracy, and purpose. However, you can't really determine those without actually going into the source. So we're going to talk a little bit more along those lines. What questions is this article helping you answer? Is it providing a meaningful support in some way? How does it compare to other sources you found? Is it saying a lot of stuff along the same lines, or is it offering a drastically different viewpoint? And where and how does it fit with the rest of your paper? Is this an integral piece of providing support for your argument? Or are we just trying to slip that fourth source in there and calling it a day? It's okay, I've been there. So what do we expect when we get into a scholarly article? Typically, it's broken down into quite a few parts, and we're going to talk about them in more depth in a moment. So those parts are going to be the abstract, the introduction, the literature review, methods. Sometimes this is called methodology, results, discussion, and conclusion. So I broke these down with little bits of examples. If you were an INST 150 the last 2 weeks, you probably heard a little bit about the abstract. The abstract is kind of a juicy little snippet you get at the beginning of the article or when you find an article in a database. It gives you an idea of what the article is about without requiring you to read the whole thing. There's typically enough in there for you to decide, okay, I'm willing to invest my time in this without you needing to read the whole thing, or, gives you a good incentive that like, okay, I need to go back and change up my search a little bit. So this one is for an article called Exploring Social Media as an Information Source. I have all the authors right here, and this is the big, long, not necessarily so long abstract. It's giving me an idea of what this is, what are some key facts about this already, and what are they going to try and do with this article. After the abstract comes the introduction, and they start off by telling us in today's world, information moves fast. Boy, howdy, does it. And they start introducing their ideas. It's kind of like laying the groundwork, providing the setting, if you will. And as it goes on, they're going to talk more specifically about why do we not use social media in information literacy instruction, perhaps. But it also leads into the literature review. Like I said before, this article is about the inclusion of social media and information literacy. It's going to go into some previously published work on this area. It's also part of providing the landscape. It's going to tell us what have the big findings been so far? Has there been any big change over time? A literature review might also include some information about potential gaps in the literature, for example. When I worked at a community college, I had to do a lot of research about the benefits of information literacy instruction, specifically as it applies to community colleges. Boy, is there not a lot there. That's a gap in the research. So a literature review can also be a really nice place to find some additional sources or find somewhere you want to dive in a little deeper. After literature review, we start talking about the methodology. So a lot of the papers you're going to read include studies. The methodology breaks down, how are we doing this? What are our big questions and how are we going to get our answers? So for this one, they tell us right off the bat, we're trying to answer these 3 questions. And we're going to do this by sending a survey to so many different librarians and hoping they send it back to us. Sometimes it's a little more technical, but this one is really just a survey. All right, finally, results. This is where we kind of break it down. We get the information about what did they find in their survey? What did they find in their experiment? Sometimes they just give it to you straight, but a lot of times there are also figures that go along with this. If you're a little more sciencey, they'll probably give you some chi-squares and stuff like that. But you guys will also see there are a lot of tables included. For example, table 1 also shows how response identified with the nature of their positions, blah, blah, blah. That's part of it. And then we have discussion where we kind of go into a little more depth about like, okay, this is what we found. Now, what does it mean? What can we possibly infer from this? Or how does this match up with what we discovered in the literature review? It also talks about the tables, so it is important to read those sometimes. And then finally, we talk about the conclusion. The conclusion wraps it all up, much like your paper's conclusion will. So now that you know that, let's talk about what do you think about when you are selecting an article to read or to use for your paper. First, the first suggestion I have is read the abstract. That's typically enough to tell you if you want to go dig in deeper. Another option is reading the first and last paragraphs, get the introduction, get the conclusion. And from there, you'll determine if like, okay, this is talking enough about what I want to talk about. And then we also have the option of reading selectively. So we just went through all those parts of the paper in the typical order you'll find them in. What if I told you that I don't typically read academic papers in that order? You'd say, wow, Caroline, that's crazy, but it actually makes a lot of sense. So where do I start? Typically, I start with the abstract to determine this is what I'm interested in. This is something that's going to benefit me in some meaningful way. From there, I go into the introduction. That kind of gives me the background or the setting, if you will. It lets me know like what are the main goals here. After that, I skip all the way to the conclusion, but I don't end there. I look at the discussion. So I know how it ends, and now I know what do we get out of that. Finally, I do read the literature review. I think that gives me a nice, a little bit of information about like what's already been established for this field. What do we know is a fact? Or what is accepted as a fact, or would be the more appropriate. Well, I just told you guys my order of things, but there are also a couple ways you can help yourself as you go about your reading. One option is highlighting. I don't use this very often, as you guys can probably see. The things I think are important are so many, and there's more highlighted than what's not highlighted. So if you're someone who can be a little more sparing than me, I recommend this. I think it's a really good thing to do. There are some people who have different highlighters and like color coding things. I'm not one of those people, unfortunately. Something that does work for me is taking notes. So you guys just saw the abstract here, and these are my notes on it. So I have the title up here. I made a little citation there just for my own benefits. And you guys will notice as we read through this, I have the page numbers at the end. So some of this is already in my own words, but sometimes you'll see that I have some areas that are in quotations. That means I literally directly pulled that phrase from the article, or I pulled their wording. That means I definitely need to include a citation, or I need to reword it in some more meaningful way. Like 80% might just be a little nitpicky, but 8 out of 10 might be a nice little way to subvert that. I just kind of read through and I type up what do I think are the big ideas or what do I think is important. Because I'm only using the abstract as for this example, I sure put a lot down in there. Like I said before, I keep my specific quotations or my specific references in quotations like that 80%. How are teaching librarians using social media as an information source in their instruction? Sometimes, I just kind of went line by line, but sometimes you can do that for full paragraphs, be like, okay, well, the literature review determined this, that, and the third thing. So-and-so's name comes up a lot, so they seem to be a big authority in the field. They probably do a lot of research on this. Is there anything you want to add? Do you note take or are you a highlighter, Ruby?
Yeah, I am both.
Mhm.
I think another good way to think about like figuring out what's important in a paragraph, sometimes that's the hardest part, right?
Yeah.
This might be such a challenging thing, an annoying thing, because you're like,
Mhm.
well, what if I just highlighted this whole paragraph, isn't it all important information? Like, so sometimes asking yourself questions of like, okay, what is one thing I learned from this paragraph? What is one new idea of this paragraph? What is one new piece of vocabulary that this paragraph is introducing to me? Or a new statistic that this paragraph is introducing to me. Sometimes it's easier to like answer the question than it is to ask the question to figure out like what's important. But sometimes that's how I circumvent like, oh, everything in this paragraph is important. Of like, let me pick just the one thing. What is one thing that if somebody asked me what this article is about, I could regurgitate that information. Like, oh, 80% of 18 to 29-year-olds use social media. That's probably a big thing. Everything else in that paragraph is also important. But if we are writing an essay on
Right,
thinking
we
about
probably
social
don't
media.
need necessarily like, oh, the study aims to shed light.
Right,
Well, we pretty much just need the 80% of the
Mhm.
students in this age range, they use social media. Most surveyed librarians are not using social media for instruction. So those are like the two, I guess, biggest points here.
so yeah, sometimes it's what I could find helpful is like asking yourself, like, what is one thing I learned? Or what is one stat that's new?
I find that's especially important if you're determining what you're paraphrasing and what you're gonna directly quote. Cause the 8 out of 10, that's definitely a paraphrase. There's nothing very unique about how that's phrased or spoken about, 8% versus 80% versus 8 out of 10. Nothing too crazy there. But if there was a very particular way something was phrased within a paragraph or within the abstract that I find, oh man, I can't say that any other better way, that's gonna be a direct quote. So that's what you need. So that's what I highlight. I tend to
Yeah.
highlight the things I'm going to directly quote, and I will make notes on what I'm gonna paraphrase. And I distinguish them that way. So I'm also a do both.
I think it's a skill and you definitely develop it over time. So if you're just starting reading academic articles, you might highlight a lot more than you need. You might take notes that ultimately don't make it into the paper. But by the time you're in your senior year, you'll have a better eye for it.